For many, the holiday season is a time of goodwill and generosity, a time that is best spent with friends and family, sharing gifts and eating well. Every story has two sides, one light and one dark. In terms of Christmas, one of the best examples of this is Krampus, the dark counterpart to Saint Nicholas. In the French regions of Alsace and Lorraine, there is another example of the darker side of the Christmas season. Another dark companion of Saint Nicholas, who is said to punish children who were unworthy of the gifts that he would bring. A character called Trapp. While there are some variations of this legend depending on the region, the most well-known goes something like this. In the 15th century, there was a wealthy man named Trapp living in the region. He was a very cruel man, one that the people lived in fear of. He was heartless, vain, and greedy, and he reveled in acts of cruelty and sin. Hans had had such an insatiable thirst for power that he made deals with the devil to enhance his status, his wealth, and his power. And once obtained, he would use it to torment the people that lived in the region. But his cruel reign would come to an end when the Vatican heard of his involvement with the occult. Hans would be arrested and brought before the Pope. His sentence? Excommunication. He was banished from the region, and his land and his property were seized. The people who once feared him now shunned him. Now penniless and shunned by all, Trapp was forced to seek shelter in the woods nearby across the border in Germany. But this punishment would only serve to fuel his anger. He threw himself into occult studies and demonology, consumed with the desire for revenge upon everyone he felt had wronged him. Now living alone in the forest with only his occult studies to keep him company, Trapp's mind deteriorated more and more. It didn't take long for his desire for revenge became one for human flesh. This new craving fueled his madness, and he became desperate to satiate his hunger. Soon, the desire to consume human flesh became so overwhelming that Hans devised a plan. He had the idea of disguising himself as a scarecrow and waiting in a field for anyone to pass by. He would stuff his ragged clothes with straw, and then he went out into the field posed as a scarecrow and waited. It wouldn't be long before the first victim arrived. A young shepherd boy was walking through the field, and as soon as Hans spotted him, he wasted no time. Once the boy was close enough, Hans leapt forward and immediately stabbed the boy with a sharpened stick, over and over again until all life was gone. Hans would then drag the body back to his shack in the forest, where he butchered it, roasted it, and was getting ready to consume it. But before he was able to take his first bite, he would be struck by a divine bolt of lightning. Trapp then fell lifeless to the floor, slamming his head on the table on the way down. There are some variations of the legend where Hans had roasted a body over the fire and had consumed it by the time the lightning bolt struck him. Either way, a lightning bolt sent by God ended his would-be reign of terror. This tale would be told to naughty children, warning them that the spirit of Trapp lingers. If they don't behave, Hans might decide to pay them a visit, to take them away and eat them. As I mentioned, there are some variations of the legend. One version of the legend say that Hans regretted his actions, his cruelty and his life of sin. In these tales, he might still visit misbehaving children, but instead of taking them away from their homes to consume them, he may instead visit them dressed as a scarecrow. He then tries to get the children to change their ways and improve their behavior. Though it's no less terrifying, because scaring the children is the tactic that he chooses. So it's easy to look at this as a creepy tale told to children who were misbehaving and nothing more than that. However, that's not the whole truth. As is often the case in these types of stories, there is a grain of truth to the legend. And the grain here is that the tale of Hans Trapp is based on a real person. In the 15th century, there was a German knight named Hans von Trotha, the fourth son of the Archbishop of Magdeburg's Marshal, Thilo von Trotha. Hans's exact date of birth isn't clear, but it's estimated to be in the mid-15th century in what today is the German state of Saxony-Anhalt. In the late 1470s, Hans would enter the service of the electors and Counts Palatine of the Rhine of Heidelberg, a role that he was most likely given due to the family's connection with the Archbishop John of Magdeburg. But Hans did prove himself in that role, and by 1480 he was given 2 castles in the Franco-German hill range of Wasgau, Berwartstein and Grafendan. Hans would immediately start work on one castle, Berwartstein. He erected an outpost that would be given the name of Little France, which enabled a piece of open ground known as the corpse field to be covered by a crossfire from the directions of either the northern castle or the southern Little France. As this field was the only place where cannons could be deployed against the castle, this effectively meant that Hans had made the castle impregnable, only 4 years after he had been given the castle. This is a fact that would be proven many times over the following years, with the castle never being conquered, at least not by humans. In 1591, the castle would burn down as the result of a lightning strike. However, Hans acquiring this castle would lead to a feud with Henry, who was the abbot of the Order of Benedictine monks at Weissenberg Abbey. The reason for this was that the castle and its belongings originally was the property of the monastery. In the eyes of the abbot, Hans had not acquired the castle legitimately because it was only ever intended to be placed under the protection of the elector. But the elector decided to ignore this and give the castle to Hans in 1480. 5 years after that, Hans would demand the belongings of the castle, meaning the estate. When he did, the abbot would turn to the elector for the protection that the castle was supposed to be under. But the elector did not support the monastery. At first, he would make a lot of excuses. And when those excuses were wearing thin, the elector decided to elevate Hans to the rank of marshal and sold him the possessions, meaning that Hans was now the sole owner of the castle, which infuriated the abbot. So this led to a feud between the monastery and Hans. The dispute would only get worse and worse, and it reached its peak when Hans would build a dam near the village of Bobenthal, which was roughly 5 kilometers south of the castle. Hans building this dam meant that a nearby town was deprived of its water supply. To make matters worse, the town was located downstream of the river, so a small reservoir was formed and ended up flooding the water meadows in front of the town. Now more people were aware of this feud, and the abbot would file many complaints about this dam being built. Eventually the dam was destroyed, but that only served to cause a flood that devastated the town economically. Now it could no longer be called a feud, it was an all-out war. one that got so bad that even the emperor would step in to get them to stop. The abbot refused. Instead, he decided to turn to Pope Innocent VIII in 1491, but nothing would come of it. And in July 1492, the Pope would pass away, and he was succeeded by Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo de Borgia, in August 1492. And the abbot immediately brought his problems to him. But again, nothing would come of it until 1499, when Hans was summoned to the papal court by Pope Alexander VI, with the intention of subjecting Hans to questioning about his loyalty to the church. Hans refused to go to Rome. Instead, he chose to write a letter to the Pope. In this letter, he emphasized his Christian faith, but he also accused the Borgia Pope of immorality, which, if you're familiar with the Borgia, that is something that Alexander VI was and is notorious for. Still, the Pope did not appreciate these accusations, and an anathema was then issued against Hans. An anathema is a formal excommunication by a church, which is exactly what would happen to Hans. As if that wasn't bad enough, Hans would also get in trouble with the Roman-German king who later became the emperor, Maximilian I, who in 1496 would pronounce the imperial ban on him. Despite having his back for the longest time, the elector was now worried. So, to avoid sharing the fate that befell Hans, he renounced his vassal, at least publicly. In private, the elector arranged for Hans to be sent to the French royal court during the Italian wars, with the reasoning being that his diplomatic skills could be useful. While he was at the French royal court, Hans would prove himself to be useful to the court, and he would be awarded with the Chevalier d'Or knighthood by the French king Louis XIII. Not much else is known about Hans until his death on the 26th of October 1503 at the very castle that caused the feud with the abbot. He passed away of natural causes, and after his death, his charges were posthumously lifted. Hans only had one heir, a son named Christoph, who would inherit the castle in 1511. Christoph would pass away without any male heirs, and the castles would then go to his widowed son-in-law, Friedrich the Elder of Fleckenstein, causing the end of Hans's line. Hans was interred in St. Anne's Chapel. A memorial tablet would not be placed on the chapel until 1967, but as we know, his story did not end there. It's hard, if not impossible, to say when the truth became legend, but in the centuries following his death, Hans became the main character in various stories under the name Hans Trapp. It's always interesting to see how real people, real stories, evolve into legends and myths about monsters and, in this case, murderous scarecrows. The legend of Hans Trapp does use many details from the real-life story of Hans von Trotha, though he was never forced to live penniless in the forest. Instead, he got a new position and a new title at the French court. It's possible that Hans was an easy person to paint as a villain. He did build the dam that caused the town to be flooded, which I'm sure angered a lot of people. He was also a very big man. Hans was about 2 meters tall, which would be an imposing figure even by today's standards, but absolutely massive for the time. It's also theorized that the feud he had with the abbot and the troubles he was in with both the emperor and the pope served as the basis for the legend. So you have this giant of a man who is feuding with the church and is getting in trouble with the pope and the emperor. That seems like an easy story to take and turn into the story of a cruel man who gained wealth and riches from dealings with the devil. This massive brute who abused his power and caused people to suffer. who later transformed into a bogeyman in search of human flesh, which in turn then became the cannibalistic Scarecrow of the legend. But that's not the only story of Hans Trapp. He has also been portrayed as a Black Knight, which is a very common character in various medieval tales, who often are portrayed as villainous figures who wears black armor, who disguise their identity and use their anonymity for misdeeds. Hans's Black Knight persona is said to be a restless spirit who stalked through the Vasgau at night. There's also a story called The Legend of the Jungfrauensprung, where Hans was named as a robber baron who intended to rob a virgin of her innocence. The story goes that Hans would chase the young maiden, and in a blind panic, the maiden found herself at a cliff with the houses of the town below. Hans was still chasing her. The maiden decided to jump. She would survive thanks to her skirts acting as a parachute, which allowed her to float gently down to the ground. Now, how we go from there to Christmas is almost even more unclear than the origins of the legend itself. But the legend of Hans Trapp would become ensnared with tales of Christmas, once said to punish children who were unworthy of the gifts that Saint Nicholas would bring, much like other figures such as Krampus. In the town of Wissembourg, there is an annual night parade with Hans Trapp. There's even a guided walk that includes visits to his tomb at the end of December each year. So while Hans von Trotha only had a small chapter in history, the legend that was made from his life still lives on. Hello everyone, thank you for watching what is the last video of this year. I'm gonna take a bit of a break after this to recharge and just enjoy the holidays, and I hope all of you will be able to do that as well. I just wanted to pop in here to give a huge thank you for all of your support in whatever way you offered to give it. I'm super grateful for it. So I just wanted to pop in here and to wish you all happy holidays in however way you might celebrate, and I'll see you next year in the next video.